Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a delight. I am getting a slight echo on the sound here, so bear with me. I will take any questions as we go because I know this is an interesting and convoluted topic, and I'd like to make sure it's as worthwhile and useful for you guys as it possibly can be. So if we can start with some slides, please. And I've actually changed the topic of this a little to what's your plan for more sustainable IT? Because the original uh, the original document was what's your plan for sustainable IT? And I think it's important for us to point out that there is no such thing as sustainable IT. There is less damaging IT or more sustainable IT, but IT in general has a footprint and many other impacts that we often don't think about as IT professionals. So hopefully by the end of today, you'll be a little more aware of those and start to think about the decisions that you make on a daily basis that can have an impact on our planet and our society. So next slide, please. Obviously, given the topic of the day and the audience that I have here, I thought it was important to tell you that every business has a responsibility under Truth and Reconciliation to take action. And I can tell you that the first request under the Truth and Reconciliation report was for businesses to adopt UNDRIP. And I can happily tell you that HP has just added that to our global human rights policy. So I'm very excited about that. It took me a while to get that done. But just to echo Cherish's thoughts about the difficulty of technology in Indigenous communities in general, we have been working for this for some time now and partnered with a number of nonprofits, including Chapter One, who were part of our Digital Equity Accelerator program this year to help with early literacy for Indigenous youth, and including creating reading books in Indigenous languages, which is very necessary. You might also be interested in this little thing here, CILA, which is Coalition of Innovation Leaders Against Racism. It's useful for all organizations, I think, in attracting and retaining diverse talent, and I found it a very handy book to have a look at. And then just coming back to the education piece, I'm actually vice chair of the board for Learning for a Sustainable Future, which works to advance sustainability education in the K-12 space. And HP just funded some 40 new Indigenous resources to be put into this database that's used by over 100,000 Canadian teachers worldwide, across the country, and some worldwide teachers. And also added an Indigenous search function. So more teachers will have access to high quality content that they can leverage to use in Canadian classrooms. So we're very excited about that. Next slide, please. So I'm going to ask you to just think for a moment about how you as an individual feel about the climate catastrophe. And I'm using that phrase very deliberately. You're seeing pictures here. We're hearing about the next hurricane for Florida already. Greenland losing 30 million tons of ice an hour, coral bleaching, carbon emissions going up. How do you feel about this? I gave a presentation on this last week, and one of my own employees said, well, I was evacuated in a forest fire not too long ago. I now keep a bag ready to go by the front door. Very visceral impact of the climate catastrophe. And whether you are impacted in that direct way or not, we're all seeing the impacts around us. And for many of us, it makes us feel that we have no control, or we don't really know what we can do about it. We were never taught any of this stuff. And it makes you feel a little hopeless. And so I'm hoping that by the end of today, you will have some concrete things that you can do to help tackle these issues, and take it away and take some action, and it will make you feel better. Action is the antidote to hopelessness. So next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit. The last time I spoke at this event, I focused entirely on the circular economy. I'm going to spread this presentation across a couple of things. We're going to talk about the circular economy and why it's so important, but then I'm going to talk about turning to how you do sustainable procurement as part of the circular economy. So I started off by telling you that technology products themselves and the use of technology cannot be considered sustainable. We need to think about how we're using them, how many we have, what we do with them throughout their full life cycle. And it's really related to this piece here, this headline from The Guardian in 2020, and this number's probably gone up since then. We're digging 100 billion tons of stuff out of the ground to make the things that are all around us right now. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that you can't keep doing that on a finite planet. But also you might be wondering what's the impact of that 100 billion tons as you dig it out of the ground. So next slide, please. So no spoiler alert here that 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing the climate catastrophe and 90% of species loss and water loss are tied to digging that 100 billion tons out of the ground and moving it around and using it in the things we use it. So there's a very clear connection to resource use and the catastrophes that we're facing. And if I told you there was something we could do about it, just in our day-to-day purchasing decisions, you might be impressed that you could actually take action. But how are we running things today? Let's have a look at the next slide and we'll see what the linear economy looks like today. So we dig that 100 billion tons out of the ground. We make something with it, and in this case, I'm using an example of a plastic water bottle. We use it, it can be for a very short period of time, and if we're lucky, it goes back into a hole in the ground called a landfill. Most Canadians think that they're doing recycling and it's avoiding landfill, but actually it's not, and I'm going to show you some data on that in a second. And if we're unlucky, plastics in particular are ending up in the wrong places. Next slide just shows you what the linear economy looks like. And that picture on the right-hand side was actually taken by one of the nonprofits that we work with, just showing you how appalling it is. And not only is it contaminating nature, but it's also a waste of resources. If we could take those plastics and put them back into circulation, why shouldn't we do that? So we wouldn't have to dig for more oil to make more plastic. And we're all familiar with some of these other Great Pacific Garbage Patch and this news report last year that 70% of products in Canada's produce and baby food aisles now wrapped in plastic. We need to move away from that. Next slide, please. So the circular economy is a way to tackle this. It's not about fixing the waste issue, it's about fixing a design issue, and it's really what our grandparents did. In many cases, they didn't buy very much. What they bought, they expected to last. They repaired the heck out of it, and when it was really dead at the end of its life, they cannibalized it for parts. So that's what our grandparents did, and we're trying to incent a more circular economy in the way that we do things today, and it starts with design. It always starts with design and thinking about the full life cycle of a product before you actually even start to build it. How can you minimize the impacts as you're making it? How can you minimize the impacts as it's being used? How can you minimize the impacts when it's reached its end of life and it can be properly recycled? So we need engineers to be thinking more about that. We do measure how circular the world is today, and unfortunately it's going in the wrong direction. I think partly because of the pandemic, but it's been going in the wrong direction for a few years now. So globally, just 7.2% of that 100 billion tons of stuff that we dig out of the ground actually gets put back into circulation. And we know how to do that better. We absolutely know how to do that better. So let's just ask the question, are we on track with what we're trying to do in Canada? And I want to show you the next slide where we look at globally. If every country in the world met their climate Paris Accord agreements for cutting carbon emissions, we would still only be 15% of the way towards holding the global average temperature rise by 2 degrees. We'd only be 15% of the way there. And we know that we're a developed country and we're not on track. And that's not counting all the countries that are at war or famine, drought, fire, floods, you name it. Those climate pledges are not enough. We need the circular economy to make up the rest of that carbon reduction to get us to hold below 2 degrees C. The crazy weather we're seeing today is the impact of 1 degree of warming globally. And the scientists are telling us anything over 2 degrees C and all the bets are off. They don't even know what will happen. We will absolutely blow past even more of the planetary boundaries and we'll be into runaway climate catastrophe. So hopefully I've scared you enough into thinking we need to do something about this. Let's have a look at Canada's data. Next slide, please. So most Canadians will tell you, well, I do recycling, so I'm doing my part. Recycling is not where it's at. And Canada, in fact, is only 6.1% circular, so we're not even as circular as the global average. And this was a report that I worked on with the federal government. If we don't make some changes, we get a 40% increase across the board in all the things we don't want. However, there are some other countries that are doing this well, and we can look to them for some advice and inspiration, proving the art of the possible is actually possible. So the question is, how do we get from 6.1% to something reasonable? HP's goal is a 40% goal for circularity. We're at 40% today. We have a 75% goal by 2030. And we believe that's doable. But we need customers to come with us, and that's partly why I do some of the speaking events that I do. So let's have a look at some business models for circularity that will help us all get there. Next slide, please. So here you can see there are 5 business models that, if they are implemented, will pull us towards a circular economy and get those impacts from digging that 100 billion tons to be much lower. So the first thing is, obviously, as we design a product or a service to be built, we want to build it with renewable, recoverable, or biodegradable sources. So if I told you I could sell you a computer or a printer that had a high percentage of post-consumer recycled plastics in it, wouldn't you want to buy it? Absolutely. But I have yet to see a bid document in Canada where anybody specified higher percentages of recycled plastics or metals or any of the other things in there. The next thing is for suppliers to sell a product as a service and for buyers to buy as a service. This is much more common in other countries than it is in Canada, and it is, from a buyer's perspective, the single biggest thing you can do to contribute to the circular economy, but it's not as simple as that. We want to make sure that we can extend product lives by repairing them, upgrading them, but they have to be designed to be done like that. And a manufacturer has to provide spare parts to enable repair to happen. So there's a symbiotic relationship there between buyers demanding it and suppliers providing it. You've all probably used some of the sharing platforms, whether it might be Uber or Airbnb. That's where you're getting the maximum usage out of something. Most vehicles sit on the side of the road, not being used, parked more than they do get driven. So that's where we maximize the use of something that we've invested those resources in. And only then do we get to this take back and recycling program, where, again, you have to design to enable recycling to be done well. It's pretty much possible to recycle anything, but what's the cost to do it? And that's why many of Canadians' recycling systems don't really work very well, because there's no investment in the back end to separate all the things that we need. Metals are easy to separate, but plastics not so much. The technology exists, but who wants to pay for it? And if there's no market for those recycled materials to go back into new products because nobody's buying with that in mind, you might as well just put in a hole in the ground called a landfill. So that's the business models of circularity. Let's have a look at the next slide and why sustainability is necessary in your organization. So it's not just Francis telling you this. Gartner had it as number 3 in its top 10 list for 2024. I think it was number 8 or 9 last year. So it's moving up in terms of importance as we grapple with the effects of the climate catastrophe. Excuse me. We're seeing that expectations from all stakeholders, whether it's your employees, your investors, your governments, your customers, everybody's expecting organizations to do more, whether you're in the public sector or private sector. And we're seeing increasing attention being paid to this by the worldwide explosion of reporting requirements and questions being asked. What we need to do is make sure that translates into action, and immediate action. And I'm going to show you how some relatively simple action can actually have some pretty good impacts. So My favorite quote here, and it's not my quote, is the fastest way to green your organization is to purchase from one that's already done it. Your suppliers in the tech industry, potentially, most of them have been working pretty hard on this for quite some time. So that's the good news. The industry is fairly advanced, but you can absolutely push it to do more and hold their feet to the fire and get even more action. When we think about all of the things that organizations buy, technology is actually one of what I'd call a poster child for the circular economy, and it's relatively easy to do. And of course, HP has a lot of expertise in this. We work with customers globally on this kind of work, and I'm going to lead you through some conversations on that now. I can just pause to see if anybody has any questions. I'm not hearing any. I can move along. Next slide, please. So if anybody makes a sustainability claim to you, and you heard in my bio introduction that HP is Canada's most sustainable technology company, I hope you would be asking, how can you prove that? And it's a very bold claim to make, so I put this proof together and got my lawyers to approve it. I don't want to go through this in detail, but perhaps a couple of the awards where it's external people telling us that we are a leader. Been listed as one of Canada's greenest employers for 17 years in a row, and we are listed globally as one of the top 100 most sustainable corporations worldwide by the Canadian organisation called Corporate Knights. If we'll move on to the next slide. We also feel sustainability is really at the heart of HP and essential to our business strategy. If we just move to the next slide, fully 60%, more than 60% of our revenue today, next slide please, more than 60% of our revenue today comes from products that would be classified as sustainable, again, by Corporate Knights. And what that tells us is that A, there's a demand from customers to have more sustainable products, and that you can do well by doing good. And this is proof of it. And we publish this information. We've been publishing either percentage of sales or actual total revenue amount for about the last 5 years now, and it's growing as we speak. So whether you're in your own business, whether you work for a nonprofit, whether anywhere, there is an opportunity to make money by doing the right things. Next slide, please. So when we talk about sustainability, we want to have some very clear goals because you need to know where you're going. So I think we have 20 or so big goals that we publicly disclose on, and then annually update how we're doing against those goals. And of course, sustainability is a very broad topic. It's not just circularity or environmental stuff. You need to be thinking about human rights and digital equity, quite a broad span. So make sure when you look at your suppliers' performance that you're asking them the right questions on all kinds of things, not just on environmental stuff. Next slide, please. So Gartner, as I said, have been thinking about this for quite some time, and they keep upping the ante here. Their last statement was by 2025, 50% of CIOs will be measured on the sustainability of their organization. They're now going a little further and saying by 2027, a quarter of CIOs' compensation will be tied to the impact of CIOs' compensation, not a quarter of their compensation, will have some linkage to the impact of the sustainable technology that they're using. So the message I'm trying to get across here is that if you haven't thought about sustainability and technology, you need to be thinking about it now, because things don't change that fast. So we need to get working on it today. Next slide, please. Now, when you ask a CIO who has no sustainability background where they might think that the carbon impacts from their organization would be, they'd usually go to the data center. And they'd be thinking about the cloud and where the data is being stored. But actually, this lovely McKinsey report here actually talks about, for most organizations, it's end user devices, because there's more of them than there are servers in a data center, and they tend to get replaced more often. You can see some examples here on the left-hand side, how frequently some of the end-user devices are being changed. So collectively, when we add that up, that is more of an impact. And this particular McKinsey report, I'm going to go into a couple more in-depth looks at where they're recommending you focus your efforts. But let's go to the next slide and just look at the typical examples of technology and where the impacts are coming from. So I love this quote that if you add 2 years of use or life to the average PC, you'll reduce its carbon footprint by 30%. And that comes from TCO certified. And let's start with looking at the notebook computer on the left-hand side here. So what you can see here, this is the carbon footprint of 3 types of IT technology. So we've got a notebook, a server, and a printer. And what we're looking at here is where are the impacts for the carbon. And that's just one element of sustainability of our tech, but let's use it as a proxy. For a notebook computer, it is nearly 80% is in the manufacturing of the thing. So when you think about how you're going to reduce the impact of that, you want to really make it last as long as possible. That's why that 2 years of life to an average PC decreases its carbon footprint by 30%. How can you extend product life? So hold that thought. If we're looking at servers, the biggest impact is during their use phase because they tend to stick around for longer. So if you were purchasing a server, the energy efficiency of that server and how you program it to run at its maximum efficiency would be the things you'd be thinking about. And then for a printer, it is really the paper usage that's important. So how do you make sure when you print, you only print once, that you print the best quality output that you can on the least impactful paper that you can, and you eliminate unnecessary printing. So those would be the 3 guiding principles of the things we're going to talk about. Next slide, please. So this is back to the McKinsey report, and they talk about abatement potential. So that's how much carbon can we reduce versus the investment needed to do it. And as you can see in the top right-hand corner, the items 1 and 4, I'm going to show you what those are in a minute, but I really want you to look at this no regrets moves. Simple sourcing changes with minimal investment can address much of the emissions of end-user devices. What's not to like about that? So here's your challenge. I know it's after lunch and you're probably feeling sleepy, but this is your challenge. Simple sourcing changes. So let's get into some more of that. So what is item 1 and 4 on this grid here? Next slide, please. So item 1, optimize the number of end user devices. Don't buy more than you need. Make sure that the ones you are using will last a long time, and increase that product lifespan via sourcing changes. So buying higher quality products that are repairable and upgradable. 2 simple no regrets moves for you to take. And you might say, well, okay, Francis, but what kind of an impact is that really going to have? Next slide, please. So you don't need to worry about the naming here of scope 1, 2, and 3, but what I do want you to think about is for most organizations, most of their carbon impacts is in what we call scope 3. It's just an accounting way of breaking up the carbon. And about 70% of that is coming from purchased goods and services, and IT is one of them there. So for the average organization, looking at what they spend on technology and how they spend it can have a significant impact on reducing carbon impacts. And we need to get carbon emissions down. HP's goal is 50% by 2030, Canada 40 to 45%. It's emissions coming down tomorrow, not by 2050 that's important. If we get to 2050 and we've still got a lot of carbon to go, we'll have blown past 2 degrees C and we will be in a bad place. So next slide, please. So McKinsey is saying that CIOs, or any one of you in the room who take decisive and precise action, can get carbon reductions down 15 to 20% within the first year with minimal investment. No regrets moves. Next slide, please. So let's turn to how we're going to do that. Sustainable procurement, and I'm using Dr. Bob Willard's definition here, excuse me. We're still trying to get best value for money when we're buying things, but now we have to think about 3 different things. We're looking for the most sustainable services and goods, and obviously I flipped that because in the circular economy it's about services over goods, from the most sustainable supplier. And you need to get a little bit savvy on how you measure supplier performance. The good news is there are some simple ways to do that. And then in alignment with your own organization's purpose and goals. And if you're working in the public sector and you might think, well, I don't have any specific goals, you do have a stated purpose. Cherish talked about that linkage between health and society and providing technology to support health. Well, maybe your stated purpose is health. Maybe you're working in a different field, but there's a linkage here to what your organization is there to do and the health and the well-being of the planet and the people we're serving. So I hope you take this definition with you and can apply it in all of your purchasing moving forward, whether it's for tech or other things, whether at home or at work. Next slide, please. So I said earlier on that one of the simple ways to make changes is to do simple sourcing changes. And we've already mentioned that the most impactful way to advance a circular economy is to buy as a service. So let's dig into that a little more about why that is. So when you buy PC as a service, you typically extend the product life, and I'll explain why. So the first one is, when you don't own the device and you're done with it, you give it back to the manufacturer or the channel partner, who will bring it back and will refurbish it and, if possible, give it a second life much faster than if you own it and, oh, well, somebody's got to take care of that now. It's not my job. We'll put it in a cupboard, or we'll pay to store it. Some companies do this because we know there's some data privacy and maybe some environmental issues there, but nobody's job to do it right now, so we forget about it. So the fastest turnaround time to get to a second life means that it gets a second life, and therefore we've extended that product life. And if you recall, adding 2 years of life to the average PC decreases its carbon footprint by 30%. So we absolutely want to do that, and we don't want to waste those resources. We want to put them back into circulation. We can also say that accessing PC as a service usually involves telemetry, so remote monitoring of the device, not of what's being done with the device or your data, but what's being done with the device to make sure it's being run at optimum performance. And if it needs repairs, a new battery, whatever else it might be, it gets done as needed, meaning that device is up and running for longer. It also enables manufacturers to reuse parts, and you might think, well, I don't want a reused part in my computer, but we need recycled components and reused components with high-quality devices to keep lowering that footprint and get reused materials into our products. We also see it as a deeper relationship between a supplier and a buyer. Maximum performance and durability is being provided for you. You can scale your fleet if you're buying as a service. And then if you have a device that really is end of life, giving it back to that service provider will usually mean it's getting properly, responsibly recycled. So those are all the reasons why it's most impactful to buy as a service. And I can back that up with some data. If we can just show the next slide, please. So here you can see the best tool we have for measuring scenario A against scenario B from a sustainability standpoint is called a life cycle assessment. And what we did, you can go and have a look at this white paper if you're interested. We compared buying the same device and owning it versus accessing it as a service, leasing somewhat, but accessing as a service, let's call it. And even we were shocked to see the reduction of impact across the board in all the things that we're measuring, somewhere between 25 and 30% compared to a linear model, mainly because they're getting to a second life faster. But what's not to like about that? Next slide, please. So HP's been thinking about this for quite some time, and one of the services that we're bringing to market is called device life extension. And you'll start to see not just HP, other suppliers stepping into this space where we're trying to help you stretch your budgets, increase the longevity of devices, and we will actually take care of that upgrading and maintaining devices and putting them back into circulation for organizations so that In fact, I can give you the good example. The laptop I'm looking at you from today is an HP employee refurbished laptop. I don't get a choice. I just get a refurbished laptop. It looks just as good as a brand new one. And I've had it for a couple of years now. And it's working fine for me. I don't have particularly high compute needs. So that's an example of where we test it out on ourselves first, and then we start to offer these services globally. And you should be asking your suppliers whether they can do this or not. Next slide, please. So if we look at print, again, the most impactful way is to buy as a service because we're helping you manage paper. Remember, more than half of the impact from printing was the paper usage. So looking at these data here on if you print on both sides of the page, if you have secure print, if you digitize, here are the savings that you can get. But the reality is with print, it's the least sexy part of an IT infrastructure and typically is the least well managed. If you buy as a service, your service provider is going to help you manage this and do a better job of keeping tabs on this data and encouraging you to do the things that need to be done. All those things like fleet size adjustments, not overstocking on supplies or buying supplies, the wrong supplies, and making sure that things do get recycled responsibly. Next slide, please. So how can simple sourcing changes significantly reduce impact? And we've talked about buying as a service, but now let's look at some of the other things. And we've mentioned this a couple of times. Increased recycled content. We know we can't keep digging that 100 billion tons out of the ground. We don't want the impacts that come with that. Does having increased recycled content really lower the footprint? Yes, it does. You can also buy carbon neutral services. So you're not adding any carbon into your organization at all, and you're getting your vendor to take care of that by buying offsets, high quality offsets on your behalf. You can usually get decreased power consumption, and I would argue this is a particularly important one for Canada, looking at social and environmental performance improvements locally. You want the vendors you choose to do business with to be impacting Canada in a good way, to be investing in Canada, to help Canada with our digital equity, whatever goals it might be. And we want the suppliers to compete on this, not just on price. And we definitely need increased transparency. The federal government just this year passed a transparency requirement on supply chain responsibility. All of Canada's main vendors have complied with that, so that's the good news. But it's the start of a trail towards, much better information and accountability on those extended supply chains for a typical technology product. Next slide, please. So I talk about transparency being important, and I think you should be looking at how transparent are your suppliers. And a good place to go is to CDP. They're an independent nonprofit organization that asks companies to voluntarily disclose their impacts. And they started with climate, water, forests. Most recently have gone to biodiversity and plastics. They're not scoring those yet. And of course, they have a supplier engagement leaderboard as well. So you can see here there's quite a variety, but overall the industry is doing well. They're doing some good stuff and increasingly getting better over time, which is great. Let's hold their feet to the fire. Let's keep the pressure on for all suppliers to be doing better here. And you can see here CDP assessed nearly 23,000 companies last year. HP was one of only 11 companies worldwide that scored a AAA. So pat myself on the back. That wasn't my work. It was somebody else at HP, but it's good to see that it's possible to be transparent, to do well by doing good. Next slide, please. So here's some nice data points. Nearly 2 years ago now, we passed 1 billion cartridges being recycled by HP and 6 billion post-consumer plastic bottles being kept out of landfills and put back into our products. And you can see some other data here on the recycled plastics that we're doing. And actually, a good chunk of our recycled plastics is being produced in Montreal. So it's a Canadian success story too, which is pretty awesome. And on that note, next slide, please. We actually went into a partnership with our vendor in Montreal and worked with some nonprofits to bring ocean-bound plastics from Haiti. And we were asked whether we could take these plastics, and we said, well, let's give it a try. Our wonderful vendor said, sure, let's do it. And fast forward, we have a very successful program until, of course, the civil unrest that's going on in Haiti. So we're actively looking now where else can we bring ocean-bound plastics from. But we were able to achieve some social impacts there as well as some great environmental benefits. Next slide, please. When we think about technology, I think you've all seen the advances in packaging that we've seen across the board. You want to be looking for sustainably sourced and recyclable packaging. So from HP, we guarantee 100% of our packaging is sourced from responsibly managed forests or from recycled materials. And we've increasingly eliminated single-use plastics in our packaging. Next slide, please. You can see some examples of what's been done next slide, please, to densify packaging. So the better the design of the packaging, the more you can fit into a skid, the more you can fit on a ship as you move the packages around. Can I get the next slide, please? There we go. So here you can see as you densify the packaging, the product pallet density goes down, and you can actually get more on a ship, which of course is decreasing your carbon footprint for shipping, or if you have to fly products, even more so. So this is a trend in the industry. Ask your vendor what are they doing and how are they doing it. Next slide, please. And here you can see bulk packaging as an example of how you can reduce the amount of packaging you have to deal with, but also all of these other benefits come with a bulk packaging idea. Next slide, please. So one of the things HP is now doing is selling you carbon neutral computing. So here you can see you can choose to buy a notebook computer either carbon neutral to your door or carbon neutral for the full life cycle of your product, and you get a sustainability benefit report. So these are some of the innovations that manufacturers are doing to help provide you with better information that you can use and share with your employees. So this is a pretty cool one. Most employees somewhat know what a carbon footprint is. They'd be pretty excited to know that they were using a carbon neutral PC and could feel somewhat proud that they were also helping lower impact globally. Next slide, please. Whether you're selling a printer or a PC or a server, you are increasingly packaging in wood-based products, so cardboard. So looking to your supplier about their forest commitments, we know there's a very big connection between carbon and forests and biodiversity in forests. So what are your suppliers doing to think about forest protection? And the nonprofit world is telling us that many of the large organizations that have a big impact on forests don't even have a policy on it, never mind actually doing any work on it. So there's a lot of opportunity here. So hold your suppliers to account on what they're doing for forests. Next slide, please. I said we sell carbon neutral PC. We also sell carbon neutral printing services. So again, helping you reduce your impact first and then offsetting those remaining emissions. Again, a great story to tell your employees. And you get, again, another report telling you how you've done. And we help you walk through reducing impact as much as possible. Next slide, please. I said the last thing that we need to do in those 5 business models of circularity was to take back and recycle. Good news is HP does a lot of that, of course. But ask tough questions. Where does it go? What happens to my stuff? I think HP is still the only vendor that tells you where our recycling plants are. And increasingly, you'll see there's some free collection. Some people might come and take your stuff away for free, but ask where it's going. There's still a lot of bad practices out there. You really need to follow what's happening. And obviously with HP, you can even get serial number tracking as a paid for service, but there's a good list of information in the sustainability benefit report that you get from the free of charge service. Next slide, please. This is fairly new, and I want you to know that this data is available. So Ecomedes is an external database. The federal government, actually, if you can just go to the next slide, the federal government's about to start using this to help their buyers look at product sustainability. And so HP's got a very large percentage of our products now are on this database. You can go and look at what percentage of recycled plastic it has, what eco labels it has, all available by region and country. So a great place for you to go and have a look for information should you need it. Next slide, please. So I've talked a lot about all of the things that you could be considering, and you're going, okay, my head's about to explode, Francis. How do I specify that? How do I actually get what I want out of my supplier? What do I need to do? So I got a couple of tools here for you, and these were developed by a nonprofit called Green Economy Canada alongside HP. And I will make sure you get the links to these. Actually, you can see it on there. You can go and download these tools today. The first one is a sustainable IT procurement self-assessment tool, which simple score out of 35, see how you're doing, but more importantly, see what you could be doing, sometimes with no additional charges. Or costs to you, should I say. Great tool being used by a lot of customers, a lot of broader public sector organizations use it, and they use it as a planning tool for we're going to do this year, but next year we want to do that, and had some really good feedback on that. And then a very simple, the document in the front here, a buyer's guide. What questions could you put in your RFP that will help bring out the things I've been talking about? Why do you want to put them in there? And what would a good answer look like? 5 questions on supplier performance, 5 questions on print, and 5 questions on PC. So I challenge you all to have a go with these tools and see whether you like them or not. If you've got any suggestions for improvement, I'm about to kick off a new project to update these. They're a couple of years old now, so I want to go back to work with Green Economy. And we're going to roll up our sleeves and get started on this. So I'd love some feedback from you if there's something you think's missing or you'd like to see an improvement in. But right now, they're free tools available for everybody to take and run with. Next slide, please. HP, of course, has our own tools. I wrote this document on the right-hand side called Purchasing the Future You Want. This is a deep dive for procurement professionals who are really curious and want to know, well, what is an eco-label and what does it mean and why should I be thinking about it? So it's really a, what should we say? It's a reference manual. You wouldn't want to read it from start to finish, but it's framed around the circular economy. And is a handy tool for anybody who wants to learn a bit more. And then HP, of course, has the 3 guides. Sorry, let's just go back. HP has the 3 guides that will help you on print, PC, and supplies. Okay, yeah, we'll go forward again now. I'm just going to ask you to think a little bit about your choice of supplier. And I think from an Indigenous community perspective, you're very used to federal government, for instance, carving off a percentage of spend to spend it with Indigenous-owned businesses, and that's great, but that leaves the other percentage of businesses not doing anything on reconciliation. And I think we need to be a little bit more savvy than that. So how can we get often the multinationals to make more investments in Canada? You should be asking them, how are you doing on community investment? I have competitors who claim they don't make any community investments in Canada. How do we let them get away with that? What reconciliation actions are they taking? How are they helping the nonprofits that they work with, and what volunteering are they doing to give back to their own communities? And you can ask them the question and then give them some points for doing the right thing, and maybe more of them will step up and do more. Next slide, please. HP has identified the issue of digital equity as being one of the areas where we can have one of the most impact. We've got a bunch of 55,000 highly trained employees around the world that we give 4 hours a month of paid time to volunteer in whatever they want. And we encourage them to make donations and really lean in. And here are some of the goals that we're doing. Lots of work to be done, and in particular we have this Accelerate Digital Equity for 150 million people by 2030. This is as of last year, 21.3 million. Just want to show you what we're doing in Canada so you can feel good about it. Next slide, please. When we think about digital equity, to have equal access to jobs, healthcare, education, all of those three things, particularly for our remote communities, require access to hardware. They need connectivity. I'm not telling you anything you don't know already, but they need good content and they need digital literacy. So we have chosen to work on this globally and try and give people things that they need. And we have focused on historically marginalized peoples. So we have a great team. Next slide, please. Our global team actually won the Time Team of the Year award that is running this program. That's pretty exciting. And next slide, we have just wrapped up the first 6 months of working with three charities that are quite focused on reconciliation and Indigenous work from a digital equity standpoint. Access to Success, which deals with persons with disability and an accelerator for organizations working on that. Jay's Care has done a huge amount of work on accessing sport to bring equality and tackle loneliness and ill health in youth across Canada. And Chapter 1 we already mentioned. So pretty excited about that. Watch this space to see some more of what's coming. So wrapping up here, I would say, I love this quote from Dave Packard, it is everybody's job here. It's not just Francis's job. I've shown you some ideas of things that you can do. Simple sourcing changes with minimal investment can have big impact and are no regrets moves. So next slide, please. Leaving you with this, let's create a better future where we can all work together on this. And you've got my LinkedIn QR code there so you can follow me and stay in the conversation. So I've done pretty well there. I'm leaving a few minutes for questions.